bringing you the truth behind the news. Welcome to The New American.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the New American Daily. It's Happy Friday, TGIF, which in this case stands for Thank Goodness It's Finished. It, of course, being the abomination of the DNC down in Chicago. We are going to talk about it. We're going to talk about Kamala's triumphant closing speech and see what it means or what it may portend for the electoral campaign. Obviously, it's getting a lot of buzz right now. We've kind of avoided the DNC for the last couple days, but now that it's over, we'd like to conduct a post-mortem. But there's more coming up, too. Aside from the flowery speech, which was long on the usual overinflated rhetoric and short on details, there's Kamala's tax plan, which was reduced yesterday to little fanfare. Well, earlier this week, and then an analysis appeared yesterday by courtesy of Americans for Tax Reform. And it turns out that she's going to, if she gets her way, she's going to raise taxes in total by around $5 trillion. That's trillion with a T, people. So rather extraordinary. In addition to that, a rather weird story. We like to cover weird stories from time to time. Just when you thought woke world couldn't get any stranger, now comes an obscure Biden administration official advocating for the queering of nuclear weapons. I kid you not. I'm not sure what I mean by that, but we're going to talk about it later in the show. Also, we're kind of on RFK Jr. watch at the moment. As we go to air, he still hasn't made the announcement, so we're not 100% sure whether he will or will not endorse Trump. But we're going to be watching live during the course of the show, and if anything changes, we'll have something to say about that. Now, before we go to our main story, our lead, let me just remind you, here at the New American Daily, we come to you from flyover country, from the heart of flyover country, right here in the Dairy State, Wisconsin. It doesn't get any more flyover than here. It's a wonderful place to live, and we have a unique red pill perspective that we at the New American, including our print magazine here, have been bringing to the American public for decades, more than 40 years, ever since long before the term red pill was even invented. We like to say we're also clear pilling people, meaning that we try to give you the clearest, most unbiased perspective, nonpartisan, non-agendaed perspective on the truth as we see it. Okay, so that is what we're about here. So subscribe to the New American. Yeah, you can. There's an 800 number that we give out at some point. We'll show you that. There it is, right there. That 800 number. You can call and subscribe to the magazine. It's a bi-monthly. It comes out twice a month, just to be clear. And in the magazine, you will get a lot more detail and in depth because it's a printed magazine, or if you prefer it, there's also an online edition version you can subscribe to. But in either case, it's got a lot more text than we can cover in a 1-hour show. This show is 5 days a week. And if you're new to our show, we'd also like you to join and to like and to subscribe and all those things. If you're on YouTube, why, come on over to Rumble. Rumble's kind of our main platform. Most of our viewership is there. Rumble, of course, is increasingly becoming known as the place where you can go without fear of censorship, without fear of being deplatformed, demonetized, and debanked. And so we have made Rumble our home for that reason. But we're also on YouTube most of the time. And we have a little thing called Locals, our Locals channel, which is our group, Locals, the New American Locals.com, which is attached to Rumble channel, where we're creating an online community. And on Locals, you can get more content and interact with me, with my colleague Paul, who will be back next week, with Gary, who's in the studio with me today, and other people at the New American. I do almost daily additional live streams. Excuse me. Forgot to take a drink of water before we started today. But anyway, I have my water here, so I'll take a sip in a moment. But we, on Locals, also do live streams about other stuff, perhaps in more detail than we would do here in the show. Anyway, so do all those things. Welcome to our show. We're glad to have you. Now let's get going with today's number one news story. So last night, Kamala Harris gave her triumphant acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention. It was the closing event of the evening, and it capped off a week of, bizarre events. So we've covered some of them on this show, but, if nothing else, I think it's fair to say that the Democratic Party, judging by the sorts of speeches that were given and the sorts of people that were in attendance and the sorts of mobs that were protesting on the streets really doesn't look a whole lot like America, at least the America that we're familiar with out here in flyover country. And yet, Kamala Harris's speech was a masterpiece of rhetorical imposture. She tried her darndest with all of her considerable lawyerly rhetorical skills to pose as something other than what she is. All right. So we're going to talk about that. In fact, I think the speech spooked a number of people. It spooked Tucker Carlson, for one thing. I mean, he did a commentary and he said, oh, my goodness, there's a chance she could actually win the race. She sounded really good. We know she's fake, but boy, she has rhetorical chops. Trump shouldn't take her for granted. He should watch out for her in the day. Funny thing, because I said that very thing on this program weeks ago when she first popped up. I warned our viewers that, don't take Kamala Harris for granted. She is a trained lawyer. Well, I know what we all think of lawyers, but one thing lawyers know how to do is run their mouths and do it effectively. That's what they're trained to do. She was a prosecutor, albeit an ineffective one, but she spent a lot of time in courtrooms trying to persuade jurors of one thing or another. So she does know something about the rhetorical arts. Whatever else one may say about her maniacal laugh, which, by the way, was not in evidence. It was carefully controlled last night's speech. Now, before we go to our first clip and then to Gary, full confession, I did not watch the whole speech. I've watched substantial parts of it, gotten the spirit of it, but frankly, I couldn't do it. But my colleague, Gary Benoit, watched every moment of it, so you don't have to. So without further ado, let's look at a first clip, and this is kind of a sampling of what we got last night.
It is now our turn to do what generations before us have done, guided by optimism and faith, to fight for this country we love, to fight for the ideals we cherish, and to uphold the awesome responsibility that comes with the greatest privilege on earth, the privilege and pride of being an American. So let's get out there, let's fight for it, let's get out there, let's vote for it, and together let us write the next great chapter in the most extraordinary story ever told.
Okay, well, the most extraordinary story ever told. Those are the concluding remarks of the speech. So let's start with that. Gary, this is Gary Benoit. For those of you who are new to the show, Gary is the editor-in-chief of the New American magazine. He's my boss when we're off screen. Okay, so as soon as we go off, I bounce straight before him and defer to his infinite wisdom. And Gary, in this case, you're the man. You watched the entire thing.
Yes, I did.
What did you come away with?
Well, I want to start first with what you just showed, Steve. The most extraordinary story ever told. I find that in the Bible. Christians find that in the Bible. And, of course, she did hit a patriotic tone, and what she said at the end is representative of the entire speech. But didn't she sound like an America firster? Like she puts America first? Didn't she sound like somebody who believes in American exceptionalism? And, of course, our country is wonderful. America is exceptional, which is why so many people over time fleeing oppression and poverty and whatnot have chosen to try to get to the United States of America. But these are things she does not believe.
It happens every 4 years.
She cast herself.
Every 4 years, the radical left gets religion.
Yes.
In the last quarter or so before a November election, the last few months before an election, they suddenly become, dyed in the wool, red, white, and blue, true American patriots. And that's what we saw, right?
That is exactly what we saw. We also saw somebody who presumably, well, she said so, championed the middle class. She talked about building the middle class. Of course, how do you build that with $5 trillion in new taxes over 10 years? And I know beginning to that later, Steve. But she talked about fighting for America's future and so forth. So if somebody really is not paying attention, simply goes by what was displayed in most of that speech, perhaps that person could be forgiven for thinking, well, gee, Kamala Harris is a champion of America. No, there were exceptions in the speech, and the exception that really jumped out at me, and as you pointed out, I listened to the whole thing, is her supporting what she calls reproductive rights. And of course, that is a giveaway right there that you cannot trust what she says, because anybody who is willing to kill innocent human life in the womb or in the process of being born is not somebody you can trust, because that is a morality, if you can call it that, that is built on sand.
Yeah, well, that's become the abortion thing has become they're so overt now.
Right.
They think, rightly or wrongly, that enough of the American populace is with them on what they call a woman's right to choose, that they no longer need to prevaricate. They can be right out there.
I believe their own propaganda. But anyway, that was an exception. On the whole, we did not see displayed in that speech the real Kamala Harris.
Well, there were a couple of things, though. If I could point out, from my gleanings, again, full disclosure, yet again, for those who just joined us, I didn't watch the whole thing, but I went through selectively and just kind of listened and sampled. And one of the samples that I listened to, she spoke out and said, when I get elected, we're definitely going to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. Yay!
Yeah, but the reason you can say that, Steve, is because you're familiar with those acts.
Okay,
you know about that legislation.
But so the point of this. So what does she mean by that? I mean, everybody in the room probably knew what she was referring to.
Right.
John Q. Public, viewing in their living room, probably didn't. Or if they heard, oh yeah, freedom to vote, that sounds like a good thing. Well, those two bills have been bogged down in the Republican-controlled House for some time. They are blatant efforts to usurp federally the state's prerogative, which is spelled out in the Constitution, to have control, at least a say-so over election laws. So the Constitution is a little bit ambiguous there, because it does allow Congress to also make election law, but the received wisdom, and certainly the intent of the founders was that the primary responsibility for setting standards for election and voting and all the rest of this stuff was with the states, and the federal government was to intervene only if there was some sort of grotesque abuse or some sort of a revolt where states refused, for example, to cast votes or something of that nature. The state government said, revolted against the federal government and said, we're going to withhold votes altogether. And so under those extraordinary circumstances, and only such, Congress, it was understood by those who see the Constitution in original terms, can come in and say, okay, well, we're going to correct this. But what these two laws would do would federalize everything about, ID standards for voting, standards for accepting votes, and all this. In other words, it would create a circumstance where the dominant, the political class in Washington would have ultimate ascendancy over voting standards, and we would no longer have debates like we had back in 2020. You wouldn't be able to challenge them because it would all be federalized, and the federal government would then, which of course the assumption would be, it would then be controlled by the uniparty, which is dominated by this faction of the Democratic Party. They would be able then to come in and say with impunity, no, you can't do that. We're nullifying this and nullifying that and so forth and so on, because these are the federal guidelines. We're done. And of course, it's being presented in terms of freedom to vote, as if what's happening now is malign suppression of voters by those evil racist Republicans. That's the subtext there. So it was there. I mean, her radical leftist leanings were still there, but it was carefully hidden.
It was hidden.
Of course, she didn't have anything nice to say about Trump either, or the MAGA movement.
Not at all.
We had some of that going on too.
But what I'd like to look at is what she did not say, Steve. I think that's very important, because there's what she said for the public at large, but what she did not say. And I picked just one example of something she did not say that she has said in the past. And the example, perhaps surprisingly, comes from November 1st of 2000, just several days before the 2000 election. And this was when
2000 or 2020?
I'm sorry, 2020. Thank you. Right, just November 1st, 2020. And just several days before that election, when she was running with Biden, she was of course the VP, and she did what she did was on what was then Twitter, of course it's now X, but she put up an animated campaign ad expressing her views. So let's take a look.
So there's a big difference between equality and equity. Equality suggests, everyone should get the same amount. The problem with that, not everybody's starting out from the same place. So if we're all getting the same amount, but you started out back there and I started out over here, we could get the same amount, but you're still gonna be that far back behind me. It's about giving people the resources and the support they need so that everyone can be on equal footing and then compete on equal footing. Equitable treatment means we all end up at the same place.
Okay, Gary, before you say anything,
Yes.
that video had stars, it had flowers, it had sun, it had landscapes. How can you possibly, you're going to tell me something bad about that video.
Well, it also had full-blown Marxism. It was simply
Puncture my bubble.
You know, she was articulating in her own words. She was recycling the Marxist dictum from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And it is amazing to me because I don't recall that ad at the time. Amazing to me that it went largely undetected. But that is the real Kamala Harris.
Yeah, well, I mean, and you know, again, these words: equality, equity, fairness, all the rest of it, progressive. They always choose these wonderful sounding terms, and they have this beautiful, verbiage that they employ that mislead a lot of people who don't think about what it means. So if you think about it from the image, the little cartoon is just now of the two men climbing to the top of the mountain, and Kamala Harris voiceover saying, "We all get to the same place." Well, no, we don't. That's not the desideratum at all. The whole point of having a free society is that we get to different places. We have very different goals. You and I are quite similar, but we're in different places.
Yes.
We've lived very different lives. Even though, we have a lot in common, but we're also different. And part of the reason that we can do a show like this is because of our differences. But we have a different family size, different religion, different housing arrangements, different incomes, and on and on and on. And obviously, this is much more the case when you step outside. And that's just within the same organization between two people who've known each other very well for a very long time.
Right.
You get outside of that and walk down the street, everybody's very different. No one wants the same thing as anyone else unless you're talking about, we all want to get to heaven after we die or something like that. But speaking of temporal goals, the things that we hope to obtain and the means that we hope to acquire to attain them, whether it's running our own business, getting some kind of advanced degree, moving and living in a certain place, or whatever circumstances, people are very different. And equality of outcome, which is what and Marxists are basically advocating, is absurd. It's absurd, because, what they want is for everyone to be alike, in a sense,
of course,
not
that is
equal.
communist theory, but in communist practice, it never works out that way, does it?
No.
Because when you look at practical communism, what we've seen throughout the history of communism is that almost everybody becomes a serf. They become a slave to the state. And it's just a powerful elite that have larger pieces of the economic pie who are at the top. And of course, there's no middle class.
Okay, well, speaking of serfdom, we can sort of maybe project the lines, as we like to say, in other words, extrapolate what will happen, what is likely to happen if Kamala Harris is elected to 1 or 2 terms as president, starting this November. Okay, so, I think it's a fair bet that she will continue most of the policies of her predecessor, of Joe Biden, and certainly of the radical left / deep state embodied by the Democratic Party. So what does that mean? It means probably that in a few more years, a lot of us are going to be eating cabbages and turnips, and living a considerably more hard-scrabble existence than we have today, because that is the unavoidable consequence of collectivization and socialism, which is clearly what she wants. And we're going to talk in the next segment about her tax plan specifically. Okay, but there's more. she also said to tremendous loud acclaim toward the end of her speech that we are going to continue to stand with Ukraine and to stand with NATO and to stand with our allies. And she had something to say about Israel as well and so forth. So in other words, the same old deep state interventionist policies that are a large factor in the enfeebling of America because of how much it costs, okay, are going to continue robustly under Kamala Harris. There will be no end in sight for the war in Ukraine, and in fact, it will likely blossom into something greater, as in with mushrooms, perhaps, in the next 4 years, let alone what could happen in the Far East with China and the Philippines and everything else. And so that whole, I mean, she poses as this fresh, young face. She's new, just like, Obama back in the day. Many of you remember, she's the face of change, and yet the stuff she was talking about, for the most part, is the same old, warmed over socialism and globalism.
Well, there's no question about that, but I would just append what you said, Steve, by pointing out that in addition to the presidency, we also have a Congress. And of course, in addition to the federal government, we also have the states. So the question is, even if Harris were to become president, what would Congress do and what would the states do to prevent her agenda from being implemented?
Well, that's a good question. Let's talk about that for a minute. How much has Congress stood in the way of some of these things that I just mentioned? Okay, we've now had a Republican-controlled House for the better part of 2 years. They came into power with a lot of high-sounding language about how they were going to stop the deep state in its tracks, and they were in this type of thing. But the moment they got into power, suddenly, oh my goodness, we have a razor-thin margin. There's no margin for error. And all of those lofty promises and all that persiflage about how, we're going to get rid of omnibus spending, and we're going to get rid of continuing spending resolutions, and we're going to cut the government down. Somehow that's all going by the way. And even as we speak, Congress is planning, and by Congress I mean the Republican leadership in the House, is planning to get yet another continuing resolution through, another omnibus-style continuing resolution through, to fund the government up to the end of the year. That's going to be their number one priority. And included in that will be yet another huge tranche of money to support the war in Ukraine. And heaven only knows what other things will be.
As well as many other unconstitutional programs.
So the point is there hasn't been any change.
But the point is we're not going to solve the problem. Let's assume, on the other hand, that Trump becomes president. What will Congress do then? Or what will the state governments do then? So either way, we can't just focus totally on the president. In fact, Congress is more important than the presidency. We need to work to have a good Congress, and we need to work to have the states say enough is enough regarding federal overreach. These unconstitutional programs need to stop at the state borders, Steve.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, I think my concern is that's the de jure posture, and we do talk about that a lot on this show, reminding people that as far as the Constitution is concerned, Congress and the House in particular, which holds the purse strings, or used to before we brought in the whole fiat money system, right? Now the government has all these other underhanded ways, deficit spending funded by money creation ultimately. Okay, so they can completely circumvent that requirement that everything be passed by the House. But leaving that aside, I guess one more question we should address and then go to our first break is, what are Kamala's prospects? Because people want to know this. And and from what I can tell from the polls is, she's gotten a bump in some polls. One poll that was being trumpeted by Newsweek this morning, post her speech, there's a poll showing her now leading by 8 percentage points nationally. Okay, well, here are a couple points. First of all, she's still nowhere near where Hillary was, or even where Joe Biden was at the conclusion of their respective coronation ceremonies masquerading as DNCs in 2016 and 2020. Okay, so if we assume that Trump will yet again overperform, as he always seems to do, right now things don't look good at all. And I think people like David Axelrod and others who are privy to the numbers behind the scene at the Democratic Party know this. Okay, so but now the real campaign starts, because this is the last thing they get to do and have a captive audience and put on a show, a dog and pony show, really a Potemkin village, as it were, kind of trying to gloze over all the things that Kamala could have been doing for the last 3.5 years as vice president of the United States, but which she has chosen not to do, like, say, closing the border, dealing with the border, and sundry other issues. Okay, now we're going to hear more about that. And there's also a debate coming up very soon.
Sure.
So
I think just a one-sentence response to your question, what are Harris's prospects, depends on how many votes the insiders are able to steal.
yeah, well, we'll see. And then obviously we'll be talking probably next week about some of the developments in places like Georgia and Arizona, hopeful developments that will make it much harder for the Democrats to steal the vote in many of these swing states.
Yes.
Not all of them. And it's still very much up in the air. So we'll see. It's amazing that we even have to talk about the election in those cadences. But that's kind of everyone's default setting right now is, they're going to try to steal the election. The key is making sure they can't steal the election, rather than the key is making sure that we get the vote out and that we win the election, by fair means, by traditional means. So anyway, it's amazing. We'll be right back.
I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. I mean, whoa. Who knows what would come out of that?
Just imagine if we have a constitutional convention, the number of people who will be unhappy and the number of people who say the results are not valid, and then they'll just ignore the entire Constitution.
What we need are just more people that would read the one we have.
It isn't the Constitution that's the problem. It is the people who ignore the Constitution that usurp power and abuse the constitutional power that they ostensibly have.
If you can't enforce an existing piece of paper, how are you going to enforce a piece of paper that has a little more writing to it? In other words, it's been amended.
It's up to us to hold our elected officials accountable.
What can you do to elect good representatives and senators in your state legislature who understand the Constitution and are willing to take a stand?
Make sure to download the Rumble app. Once you download it, search for our channel and follow the channel directly on the app. This will make sure that you get a notification every time we go live. Click the pinned live chat to download the Rumble app on your phone. It's free. If you prefer to watch us on the big screen, it's also available for Apple TV, Android TV, Fire TV, Roku, LG, and Samsung TVs. Gotta take a breath. All you need to do is search for Rumble. Okay, well, we just had a little bit of conversation during the break here in the studio, and one of our people said, I don't think I've ever seen someone quite as scary as a presidential candidate as Kamala Harris. It seems like just when you thought they couldn't get any crazier, the Democrats upped the ante. And then we agreed and said, yeah, give us the good old days of Bill Clinton. And I remember very well back in the 90s, Bill Clinton was a lot of us, myself emphatically included, were horrified by the Clinton administration, what it stood for back in the day. We expended considerable amount of ink here at the New American, laying bare all of the escapades and the criminal activities and the corruption of the Clinton administration. Of course, Bill Clinton ended up being impeached for some of that corruption. But looking back now, those days seem positively halcyon, don't they, Gary?
They sure do.
My goodness. I mean, and then, of course, along comes Barack Obama, who was much more of a gimlet-eyed revolutionary. And we got him for 2 terms, and incalculable damage was inflicted on the body politic by the Obamas. And then we thought, well, it couldn't possibly get any worse than that. And then along comes 2020. We all know what happened then. And now this. So, yeah, it's kind of like the history of this country the last 30-some years has been just, we've been on the razor's edge. And I honestly don't know at this point, looking forward, what to expect. I tend to think Trump is likely to win the election. There are a lot, but if he does, whether he wins or loses, there's likely to be, and I think most people have this is kind of baked into most people's political and economic calculus now, that there's going to be some instability. I mean, there are many factors. For example, are we entering a recession? We talked about this yesterday, and we will doubtless revisit this issue in the coming weeks and months. The economy, the state of the economy, is going to tell on Kamala Harris. But on the other hand, the people who are opposed to Trump oppose him with a ferocity and hatred that we've not seen in the American political scene since the Civil War.
And we may see that on full display in mid-September. I believe it's September 16th, Steve, when Trump is going to be sentenced. What are the prospects of him being put in jail? Yeah, what will happen then?
Well, the very latest, what I heard last night, they're claiming that apparently that they may back down ultimately. That apparently, what's his name? The district attorney has sent some kind of letter to Judge Marchand yesterday, say, in effect, recommending or outright ordering him to postpone sentencing until after the election. So there may be another stay of execution, figuratively, perhaps literally.
Could be because of their fear of public opinion, because if they actually put Trump in jail, I would think, pun intended, that would really rattle the cages of Trump supporters and galvanize them.
Yeah. So, I mean, but that could still happen. So it's not clear enough what's going on. Let me just, so let's just go kind of to our second official story here.
Okay.
Let's talk, I mean, we like to talk about the truth behind the news, the stuff that maybe doesn't have the general sex appeal that the mainstream media, the legacy media, loves to cover in vapid detail. We're going to talk about a little bit about Kamala Harris's tax plans. So for this, I'm going to put on my broken reading glasses and let's go and look at a little bit. I don't have any real images. Well, I do have one image, I think, of this, but not of the plan itself. This is boring stuff, so we're going to try to make it unboring and demystify it for you. This is what you need to know about Kamala Harris. This is courtesy for an organization called Americans for Tax Reform, which is historically the premier lobby group and I guess you say think tank dealing with tax-related measures, and whose posture is we're taxed too much. Taxes are too high. So they're very vigilant in that regard. And they itemized and kind of totaled up a bunch of Kamala Harris tax proposals and came to the conclusion that altogether they would equal about a $5 trillion tax hike over the next 10 years. I don't know about you folks out there, but that picture, that image of Kamala, I find incredibly unsettling. You know, that giant Kamala mega me in the background. There's something about that I find very, 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 very disquieting. But anyway, there's Kamala Harris, a very recent picture, talking about some of her tax proposals. And it's always couched in terms of, you know, we're going to sick it to the rich. We're going to make sure they pay their fair share. But here's what we're going to have. So apparently, there's going to be a small business tax rate hike to 39.6%. Okay? A corporate tax rate higher than the EU and communist China. As someone who has lived and worked in communist China fairly recently, I can attest to you that, ironically, tax rates in that communist country are lower for most people than they are here. And tax forms are considerably easier to fill out and take care of. Isn't that bizarre? I wonder which country is closer to being communist. It really makes you wonder sometimes. All right. So anyway, and I had friends in China who were, you know, investors and this kind of thing. And when I told them about the American tax system, in particular the capital gains, they were shocked. They couldn't believe it. To them, it seemed irrational that a country that was built on capitalism and making money would do such things. But here's some detail. So capital gains and dividends tax would be more than twice as high as communist China. The proposed top marginal rate is 44.6%. All right. Whereas in China, it's 20% capital gains. That's the top capital gains rate. So that's just extraordinary. Let's see. Unconstitutional wealth tax on unrealized gains. What does that mean? That means, and this has been a project near and dear to the Democrats for the last few years, they desperately want to tax you on capital gains that you don't even realize. So if you're John Q. Moneybags and the value of your assets climbs from 100 million to 120 million, let's say, in the course of a year. And you're not cashing any of this. It's not that you're collecting dividends, that you're getting interest or anything like that. It's just that your estate, your total worth, the valuation increases. They want to tax you on the increase. Okay? So, and tax you heavily. The rate that they're talking about here is, let me see, a 25% minimum tax on the unrealized gains of individuals with income and assets exceeding $100 million. So for the first time, people will be taxed for not actually earning anything, but merely on the possibility that they might earn something. Then they want to propose a second death tax by taking away stepped-up basis when parents die. This is something Harris has proposed, and this would impose incredible additional paperwork nightmares, and I think would more or less wipe out a lot of the current system that's in place that people use to avoid the death tax, which is by putting assets in various forms of escrow accounts and this kind of thing. in trusts, as they call them, right? So if you put things in trusts, you can avoid large amounts of state and federal estate taxes.
I wonder what that would do, Steve, to people who own, let's say, a farm, or they own a mom and pop grocery store or a business of some kind, a small business, where it's family owned, and they try to transfer that property, that wealth, that business to their children.
Well, that's consummate Marxism, because, of course, one of the major planks of Marx's program is to get rid of inheritances.
Right.
All right. And this would effectively do that. This would say, if they have their way, that there will be no more transfer of all this obscene wealth from parents to children. Instead, the government will come in. There won't be any more this web of tax breaks. You won't be able to go to a lawyer anymore and put things in trust and shield it from the grasping hand of government. Oh, no, they'll come in and they'll take their pound of flesh and take it doubly, apparently. So more death taxes, people. In addition, let's see. Oh, this is a really good one. And this squares with what we do here at the New American Daily. We talk about globalism a lot, probably more than any other news organization. And one of her proposals is, well, they call it here a global tax cartel with a 21% minimum tax rate. Well, what does that actually mean? It means that Kamala Harris wants to harmonize American taxes with so-called global standards. And by global standards, actually, they don't mean global standards. They only mean global standards for the wealthy countries. This is another scheme that has long been brooded about by international socialists to level the playing field internationally. Okay, they want all of the rich countries to tax their citizens much more heavily than, say, the government of Chad or Burkina Faso does to its citizenry. The idea being is that the rich should pay more. And what they want, what they're advocating for, is a 21% minimum tax rate worldwide.
Of course, they also want to harmonize.
Well, they do. And so
they want to harmonize tax laws on a path to world government. They want to make our national laws international laws.
Right. So we have an organization in Paris, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, which is part of the larger penumbra of UN-affiliated international organizations, and its primary concern is tax law harmonization as a prelude, as Gary mentioned, ultimately to global taxation in various. We don't need to get into that right now, but suffice it to say that Kamala Harris is supportive of this. She's come out in that. Let's see, a couple more things. Let's see. Quadrupled tax on stock buybacks. Okay, 30% federal excise tax on electricity used in cryptocurrency mining. So cryptocurrency happens to be one of the hottest sectors right now that's pushing up our whole economy. Well, she wants to come in there and impose a 30% tax on, and of course, cryptocurrency mining is very, very energy intensive. So this is probably motivated by the radical environmentalist concerns as well. And let's see, 37 billion tax on American energy, 32% increase to Medicare taxes, 24 billion retirement tax, and on and on. She also wants to supersize the IRS even beyond its already vastly bloated and unconstitutional contours. But that's a story for another day. It should be enough to know that if Kamala Harris is elected president, your taxes will go up. And yes, it's going to be you, unless you who are listening have assets of, several $100 million or more. Certainly if you do. But even if you're not in that class, your taxes will go up. Rest assured. If nothing else, when a parent passes away, you ain't going to get the retirement that your parents got from their parents and their parents from theirs and so forth and so on. She wants to nullify that. That is, as I said, a very robust part of the Marxist program. That's what's coming up, folks.
She wants to kill the American dream.
Yeah, well, they do, because they hate the American dream. They want they have a radically different vision. And I think that did come through fairly clearly and consistently during this week's DNC. Right. This is a group of people who have a completely different perspective on everything ranging from the Constitution, American history, business, economics, and on everything. Their perspective is completely opposed to what most of us in flyover country hold it to be.
And yet, look at the contrast between the reality that you just described, Steve, regarding her programs, regarding what she wants to do to America, between that and how she presented herself in that acceptance address.
Yeah, well, she's not going to be able to hide behind that camouflage anymore. I mean, she had her night in the limelight last night. She did it probably better than any of us expected, rhetorically speaking. But you can still smell the socialism. If you look carefully, parse carefully what she was saying, and certainly the globalism. That's beyond dispute. She definitely is in alignment with the neocons, the rhinos, all of the globalists, that whole faction. She made that crystal clear.
Right.
That was right out in the open in the concluding minutes of her speech.
And I'm going to add, and the totalitarianism, because when the government reaches a point where it possesses total power and it's unrestrained, and that's the direction where she wants to take this country, totalitarianism inevitably will be the result.
Yes, it will. Okay, well, we need to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about queering of nuclear weapons.
Socialism has a much stronger grip on America than I think the majority of Americans realize. I mean, all this stuff about utopia doesn't exist.
Are you ready to take a stand? Join us in beautiful Laguna Hills, California on September 20th and 21st for an inspiring 2-day event with General Flynn. This powerful event will also feature keynote speaker Pastor Paul Blair, along with a variety of important topics that you won't want to miss.
If Americans want to remain a free and sovereign nation, more people need to understand the principles and values that built this great nation. At the John Birch Society, we have the organization, the plan, and the resources to do just that. Our founder, Robert Welch, said, "Education is our total strategy and truth our only weapon." Go to jbs.org to learn more, including how you can get involved to work locally and impact nationally. Join the John Birch Society today.
Okay, quick news update. It looks to be a certainty, and we're going to cover this in our final segment today in a little more detail, but just to give you a heads up, according to the Associated Press, it just came out a few minutes ago, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., ahead of speech, says in a Pennsylvania court filing that he's endorsing Trump. So it looks to be a done deal. And we're going to talk in the next segment a little bit about how that may or may not affect the contours of this fall's electoral race. But first, let's go to a story that maybe nobody else in the online commentariat has really picked up on yet. I can't see how they haven't noticed this. But yesterday, a fascinating piece appeared in Newsweek, and the headline read, there it is, Biden nuclear security official called for queering nuclear weapons. Okay, let that sink in. Just when you thought woke world couldn't get any stranger, there's this.
I assume queering is in homosexuality.
Well, yes, queering is in homosexuality. So the queering of nuclear weapons. Now, I got to say, full disclosure, here on this show, we try to take the high road, which means that we're not going to traffic in ribald humor and anything of that sort. But I have to admit that in the preparing today's thumbnail and mapping out we were sorely tempted to go down that way. I mean, after all, what does this actually mean? Does this mean like a composite of the of the village people writing the nukes down like at the end of Dr. Strangelove? Or what are they talking about here? Well, it turns out that queering, I did not know this, by the way, and I suppose I should, because I do actually have a PhD. I spent a lot of time in academia, and I had colleagues that were into queer studies and things of this nature, which I kind of really didn't pay much attention to. It struck me as being kind of pointless. Although I do remember remarking at one time to my wife that if I'd only gotten with the program and taken my interest, which happened to be linguistics, that's what my PhD is in. If I'd gone with that linguistics PhD and published a bunch of papers and worked the word queer and gender into it, I'd probably be a tenured professor at some major university today. I obviously wouldn't do that. But that seems increasingly to be the token of the realm as far as the higher academy is concerned. Everything has to be queer this and gender that. Right. And now, perhaps in a development we should have seen coming, even nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy should be queered, at least according to Sneha Nair. Sneha, by the way, means friendship in Sanskrit. So I'm guessing she's Indian American. That's completely irrelevant. But Sneha Nair and someone else named Reitman wrote in a paper last year. Okay, so this was just last year. And Ms. Nair is a recent appointee of the Biden administration in the Department of Energy. but she wrote in a major journal, the Journal of Nuclear Weapons, I guess. Oh, no, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is a major journal. She wrote, among other things, she said, queer theory identifies how nuclear weapons discourse is gendered. Nuclear deterrence is associated with rationality and security, while disarmament and justice for nuclear weapons victims are coded as emotion and a lack of understanding of the real mechanics of security. Okay? Then she goes on and says, quote, the queer lens prioritizes the rights and well-being of people over the abstract idea of national security, and it challenges the mainstream understanding of nuclear weapons, questioning whether they truly deter nuclear war, stabilize geopolitics, and reduce the likelihood of conventional war. Queer theory asks, she says, who created these ideas? How are they being upheld? Whose interests do they serve? And whose experiences are being excluded? So I think I partly answer the question, and we'll see what Gary thinks here. This ought to be good, okay? But I think what she's saying, in effect, that the only rational basis for discourse is one that is gendered in the queer, that gets rid of all that terrible toxic masculinity. And of course, the diametric opposite of toxic masculinity is actually not femininity, it's queer. That's what they're implying. And so to get away from all those terrible things and all this nuclear machismo of old, the balance of power and all the rest of this stuff, we need to think of this in gendered queer terms. Okay? That seems to be what is meant. But it's also, it defies rationale. From my perspective, what she's saying is, well, we have basically expunged reason and rational discourse from every other sector of public life. We need to do the same now with nuclear weapons, and everything needs to be wokeified, and specifically queered. I expect in a few days, when the story becomes more current, we're going to see a lot of hilarious and somewhat ribald cartoons about this. And I'll just leave it there. Gary, what do you think about this?
Well, I think it's looking at it through the lens of being anti-man. Man in terms of men as opposed to woman, and viewing men and viewing masculinity as being responsible for all the problems in the world. And maybe if the whole world became queer, maybe there'd be no more wars.
Well, that's the idea. They don't know their history very well.
No, they don't.
A large number of wars in ancient times were fought, were prosecuted by utterly perverted Roman emperors and emperors of other empires, generals, for example, the famous general Narses in the time of the Emperor Justinian was a eunuch and apparently had very bizarre sexual tastes as a result of that. I don't want to get into that too much. It's pretty voyeuristic. But again, suffice it to say, if you want to know more about this, why then read, Procopius' Secret History, read Suetonius' Lives of the 12 Caesars, and numerous other, if you're interested in the Roman perspective, you'll see that there were plenty of very perverted individuals who both wore the imperial purple and commanded the legions of Rome. So, that's a thing. So this idea that being queer means that you're going to be nice and sweet, like, like those fashionistas, and what's the name of that show? Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, or whatever it is. This is sort of the public image that we have of so-called queers, of homosexuals, that they are nicer and kinder than the rest of us, but that's not really true. The historical record doesn't bear that up. I don't think there's a relationship one way or the other. The real issue here is that they're being subversive. Now, we talked in the earlier segments about what you can expect from a Kamala Harris presidency. This kind of thinking is another good example of what you can expect. And I promise you, whatever you may think of Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, the mullahs of the Ayatollahs of Iran, and so forth, they're not thinking about them this way.
No, they're not.
So,
and I just got to add that a nuclear weapon by any other name is still a nuclear weapon. And this queer nuclear weaponry is not going to reduce the chance of war.
Well, I just can't think, Gary. Maybe some of them have a certain misprision about history. I suspect that Sneha or one of her colleagues was reading about the history of nuclear proliferation, and they found out that the name of the aircraft that dropped the first atomic bomb was the Enola Gay, and they thought, oh my goodness, that was obviously back then.
Well,
those people were.
That makes as much sense as the rest of it, doesn't it?
I guess so. So I mean, but I mean, I do know in World War II, most of those bombers they would decorate with pictures of, of women and this kind of thing, or they would paint their girlfriend's image, or they would put things like "To Adolf" with love on the bombs. Now, if you tried that nowadays, it would have an entirely different connotation, I'm afraid. So who knows where all this will lead? Hopefully, this is just the latest flash in the pans woke sideshow. But we thought we would mention it because these kinds of things really are indicative of what you can expect going forward if these people remain in power. Let's take one more quick break.
Hi, I'm Alan Keyes. I'm the host of IMTV's daily talk show about news and events in America. And I want to say a good word for the New American magazine. Not only because Alex Newman has joined us as somebody who is periodically hosting a show, but because New American magazine represents a alternative media that is willing to tell people the truth. With so much fake news spreading about, and the fact that right now this country's in an existential crisis, we remember who we are and where we come from and what our principles are, or we die. Reading New American magazine can keep you up to the minute on the issues that are challenging us as a people and on which that survival hangs. You can check it out and subscribe at www.thenewamerican.com.
Do you enjoy the free speech that Rumble is protecting and fighting for? I know I do. Our show on Rumble is only possible thanks to our viewers supporting Rumble's platform by purchasing Rumble's products. Most of you drink coffee every day. That's why you have to try Rumble's 1775 coffee. It's actually the best coffee I've ever tried. Full disclosure, I haven't tried it. But anyway, it's the same
But
price.
you're going to, right?
Maybe. I don't know if it's decaf, but it's way better. Rumble's 1775 coffee is free from chemicals yet rich in flavor. This is because their beans are sourced from high-altitude farms in Bolivia, hand-picked, roasted weekly at their facility in Miami, and delivered fresh to your doorstep. And as believers in freedom, buying from Rumble helps fight back against woke corporations like Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts, who also have coffee. Join the coffee revolution and brew rebellion with Rumble's 1775 coffee. Go to 1775coffee.com, use code STUDIO, and get a free month's supply of their cognitive boosting supplement, Limitless, when you buy 2 bags of their coffee. Think about that. It's a crazy deal, and the supplement is worth more than the 2 bags of coffee. Go to 1775coffee.com and try their amazing coffee. Sorry about that little interjection, but some of you may know that I happen to, because of my religious beliefs, I don't actually drink coffee. But I'm happy to advertise it for those of you who do. But I wanted to clear the record there. But anything you can do to support Rumble is a good thing, because Rumble it's the new gold standard for free speech. They don't censor us. They have been very encouraging. We have a wonderful working relationship with Rumble. So not just the coffee, but anything Rumble, I strongly urge you to support. That is probably the surest way to help Rumble to grow, to help our show and others like it on Rumble to grow, and in effect to ultimately hopefully dethrone YouTube, aka the great Satan of the internet. But anyway, okay, so we're going to talk a little. We mentioned at the beginning of the last segment that it appears definite now. It is, and we're going to go with this, that RFK Jr. is not only withdrawing from his presidential campaign, from the race, he is also going to endorse Donald Trump. This is because a story has come out, courtesy of the Associated Press, only a few minutes ago, indicating that he filed material in Philadelphia indicating that he was planning to endorse the Trump campaign. This is all developed within the last hour or so. He is now, I believe, speaking live. We don't really have time to pivot to that, but it's very clear what's going to happen. And it's in the time we have left, Gary, I'd just like to talk a little bit about what this may or may not mean for the presidential race. Like it or not, and yes, I know, Congress is incredibly important, and we're going to get back to that too. But this is an absolute epical inflection point in our country's history. And this election could turn on today's events, on RFK Jr.'s
I think
decision.
a good starting point, Steve, would be to raise the question, why would RFK Jr. endorse Trump as opposed to endorsing Harris? Obviously, despite the fact that RFK Jr. is coming from the left, he comes from a Democrat liberal background, he has much more in common with the positions that Trump has taken. The Democratic Party is no longer the party of his father or of his uncle.
Well, I'm not sure so much it's a matter of the positions, because the more you look at RFK Jr., I mean, there is some overlap with regarding COVID and so forth, and obviously his deep-seated suspicion of the deep state. It's the attitude. And increasingly, you see this on the denizens of the so-called intellectual dark web as well, that some of them are token liberals and others are token conservatives, right, left, and this kind of thing, but they all agree on certain core principles. And, and clearly, RFK Jr., he's a very flawed candidate in many ways. I mean, I would not personally cast my vote for him. I understand if many of you out there feel differently. I wouldn't, for a variety of reasons, but which we don't need to go into. But I don't question the man's sincerity and genuineness. After all, his father and his uncle were assassinated, presumably by deep state, representatives. His father, most likely because of what his uncle, JFK, most likely, it's never been entirely proven, but, most likely because of what he did, standing up to the Soviet Union, standing up to the American deep state, and this kind of thing. Though he was a Democrat and by the standards of the day, a liberal, he was, I think, a genuine American patriot. Flawed though he was, we all know about that too, but he was a patriot. And Bobby Kennedy as well. So, so it's clear where RFK Jr. is coming from. I think if the country is going to be saved, we may have to back off of the notion that a political party or movement needs to be all things to all people and needs to stake out a position on every single issue, particularly at the federal level. Okay? Because the nature of federalism is that there are a lot of things that really shouldn't be the business of the federal government at all. Okay? They should be argued at the state level by state governments and people like that. So the fact that both the Republicans and Democrats feel this need to take a position on every single thing creates this dynamic where certain group of people, the independents, tend to say, well, I don't like either major party because I may agree with the Republicans 60% of the time, but then there's all this other stuff I disagree with. And instead of that, what we need to do is say, well, what are the core values that we can agree on as Americans that are absolutely critical? I can name a couple. And I think that RFK Jr. and Trump would both agree, and Kamala would disagree. One of them is an end to American interventionism.
Yes, I think they agree. And how about censorship?
The censorship's another good one.
Liberties.
Yeah, censorship's another good one.
How about lockdowns?
Yeah, the COVID lockdowns, which is another, issues like that. A lot of erstwhile liberals are coming out and are just aghast at the fact that their party, meaning the Democratic Party, is now clearly the party of censorship and lockdowns and draconian controls and all the rest of this. Right. And they're opposed to it, even if they don't like, let's say, how the Republicans stand on social issues, if they're basically liberal on other things. So it's a daunting task. But part of it is occasioned by the fact that this country is just so large now.
Now, some people, Steve, might look at COVID, well, that's yesterday's news, but actually it could be tomorrow's news as well, because we hear concerns about the next pandemic.
Yeah.
And I believe what happened, and I know Robert F. Kennedy Jr. believes what happened because he has said so, is that the previous pandemic was used as kind of a trial balloon to see how much totalitarianism they could impose, how far they could go. What's going to happen with the next pandemic?
Yeah, and that's a big issue. And then another issue, is it's very clear that the sense of the American public is they are sick and tired of fighting everybody else's wars and policing the world.
Right.
Okay? And to some extent, even Biden is kind of partly sensitive to that, but not sensitive enough to withhold our support from Ukraine, from not getting involved in that. Okay? We may not have boots on the ground in any measurable sense in Ukraine right now, the way we did in Vietnam a generation ago, but we are still hemorrhaging, metaphorically speaking, American treasure in the battlefields of Eastern Europe right now. And assuredly, the same is going to happen in the Middle East and eventually in the Far East. And Americans have had it with that. And that's another issue that we can coalesce
So we have somebody
around.
from the left or considered to be from the left, and somebody considered to be from the right, coming together because of certain essential issues that they hold in common, positions that they hold in common, because they see in Harris a threat to our constitutional republic.
Yeah, and I mean, just to wrap it up, I mean, the general assumption seems to be that this will be a boon for Trump, that it will hurt Harris, that more people who are Kennedy RFK Jr. supporters will probably follow him into Camp Trump, especially if he's brokered some kind of an agreement for a cabinet position, which I think Trump would not necessarily be averse to. Then would be inclined to peel off into Team Harris.
If that happens, let's hope he has something to do with health care.
Yeah, so we'll see. And it could be, I mean, more than one presidential election in the last 30 years has been decided by these kinds of things. Like the Ralph Nader campaign supposedly was the deciding factor that allowed George W. Bush to win in 2000 and so forth. Anyway, we're out of time, folks. It's been an amazing week. It's going to be an amazing weekend, and we look forward to seeing you again on Monday right here with more Truth Behind the News. Ciao for now.